By 1920, over half of America's wetlands and countless native crops were eradicated for profit. Native Americans once relied on 15 forgotten vegetables that outperformed today's staples in nutrition and resilience, yet vanished under railroad tariffs and monoculture expansion. Why did foods that fed entire nations disappear? And what critical knowledge did we lose? The story behind these missing vegetables changes the history of American agriculture and what's possible for our future. Railroads shaped the fate of American crops as much as any plow or seed. By the late 1800s, freight tariffs were posted in thick catalogs, listing rates by the pound, the mile, and most importantly, the type of crop. Wheat, corn, and potatoes traveled east from the prairies at the lowest rates, packed in bulk and built to last. Perishable roots like Jerusalem artichoke, prairie turnip, and groundnut were slotted into a higher bracket, sometimes costing 15 to 60% more per ton mile. Shipments labeled as roots and tubers not otherwise specified bore extra fees for refrigeration, express service, or special handling. Even a short trip from St. Louis to New York could add up. Potatoes might cost $18 for 2,000 pounds, while sunchokes, less uniform and more fragile, could run $30, with the risk of a 15 to 20% loss to spoilage before reaching market. Grading standards magnified the gap. As the U.S. Department of Agriculture formalized grades for potatoes and grains, buyers paid premiums for uniform size and appearance. The U.S. #1 potato had to meet strict rules for shape and skin. Native crops with their natural variation and unfamiliar forms were lumped into mixed roots or off-grade bins. Auction records from Chicago and New York between 1905 and 1918 show that these lots fetched 30 to 50% less than standard vegetables, and sometimes were barred from sale at all. If more than 10% of a crate varied in size or quality, the price dropped further and insurance companies charged more to cover the risk. Perishable native vegetables face spoilage rates between 12 and 25% per shipment, compared to just 2 to 5% for potatoes and onions. Rail and market rules rewarded crops that could be stacked, stored, and shipped without fuss. The logic was simple. Uniformity, durability, and shelf life brought higher prices and lower costs. Native vegetables, however nutritious or resilient in the field, didn't fit the new shipping math. As a result, they faded from commercial fields and vanished from most seed catalogs. The economic levers of the era, tariffs, grading, and freight insurance, quietly closed the door on foods that had sustained nations for centuries, leaving only a handful of survivors in remote gardens and wild patches. Between 1870 and 1920, the American heartland underwent a transformation that left deep scars on the land. Drainage ditches and tile lines cut across the Midwest, turning wetlands and marshes into fields ready for the plow. In Iowa, more than 90% of original wetlands, over 4 million acres, were drained by the 1920s. Illinois lost nearly 85% of its marshes, and southern Minnesota saw half its wetlands disappear before the First World War. Federal land survey maps and drainage district records from this era show entire regions once mapped as blue and green swaths of water and sedge redrawn as rectangles of corn and wheat. The scale of prairie conversion was just as staggering. In the tallgrass belt, over 75 million acres were plowed under between 1870 and 1910. Illinois, once called the Prairie State, kept less than 1% of its native grasslands. By 1900, nearly all of Iowa's 28 million acres of prairie had been broken for crops. The Homestead Act and railroad land grants fueled this rush, with land officers recording new farms at a pace never seen before. By the time the USDA published its first national wetland inventory, more than half of all regional wetlands were already gone. These changes did not just erase habitats, they wiped out the wild and cultivated gathering sites that had fed generations. Marsh tubers like tuckahoe, wild rice beds, and spring beautycorms relied on undisturbed water tables and seasonal floods. Once the water drained away, these plants vanished from the landscape. The prairie's deep-rooted turnips and groundnuts, once abundant in the sod, could not survive the plow. Land that had supported a mosaic of edible roots and greens became a patchwork of monoculture, engineered for storage and shipping, rather than resilience or nutrition. The ecological cost was immense. Wetland loss meant fewer natural buffers against drought and flood, and the end of habitats for countless species. For native communities, the loss was also cultural. Gathering grounds, food traditions, and knowledge systems disappeared along with the plants themselves. Maps from the early 20th century tell the story in stark relief, blue and green, fading to brown and gold. The memory of abundance replaced by the certainty of corn and wheat. The landscape itself became a ledger, recording what was gained in commerce and what was lost in living heritage. Beneath the grasslands and marshes, a hidden harvest once shaped North America's food security. Native communities turned to roots and tubers, plants that thrived where grain and leafy crops faltered. These underground staples delivered more than calories. They offered protein and minerals when drought, frost, or poor soils left little else. Jerusalem artichokes or sunchokes stood tall above ground, but their strength lay below. Their knobby tubers, rich in iron and potassium, stored well through winter. Resistant starch in sunchokes fed both people and gut microbes, making them essential for cold seasons. They outperformed potatoes in poor soils and harsh climates. Yet, as potatoes spread, sunchoke slipped into obscurity, now mostly found in specialty markets. Tuckahoe, known as arrow arum, anchored itself in the muddy fringes of eastern marshes. Harvesting meant wading into wetlands and carefully leaching or roasting the flesh to remove toxins, a process passed down through generations. For coastal tribes, tuckahoe was a safeguard against failed crops. Its loss is tied to drained marshes and forgotten preparation methods. Prairie turnip, or timpsila, once dotted the open plains. Women dug these starchy roots at the peak of flowering, slicing, and sun-drying them for storage in parfleche bags. Prairie turnips supplied protein and energy through lean months, and oral histories recalled trade routes built around their harvest. When wheat and corn replaced native grasslands, timpsila faded from daily life. Groundnut, a climbing vine with clustered tubers, wound through stream banks and woodland edges. Unlike potatoes, groundnut fixed its own nitrogen, enriching the soil. Its tubers contained triple the protein of potatoes, making it a rare source of sustenance in marginal land. Today, groundnut survives in wild patches and seed banks, protected by those who remember its value. Spring beautycorms, sometimes called Indian potato, emerged just as winter stores ran out. Marbled-sized and high in vitamin C, these corms filled the hunger gap before other crops appeared. Though their short season kept them from large-scale farming, these roots and tubers built resilience from the ground up, offering nutrition modern crops rarely match. Their decline marked not just a loss of food, but a fading connection to the land and the knowledge it once demanded. Nutrient-rich greens and resilient grains once filled the fields and wild patches of North America, offering a dietary range almost forgotten today. Lamb's quarters, often dismissed as a weed, delivered more calcium per serving than milk and more vitamin A than carrots. Its tender leaves, eaten raw or cooked, provided essential minerals at a time when other greens were scarce. The seeds, small and dark, could be ground and eaten like quinoa, supplying protein through lean seasons. Pokeweed shoots, picked only when young and under 6 inches tall, became a spring staple for many native communities. Preparation was non-negotiable. Historical protocols demanded double boiling, discarding the water each time to remove toxins that build up as the plant matures. Modern medical records document dozens of poisonings from improper preparation, a stark contrast to the safety of traditional methods. The wisdom was clear. Never eat pokeweed unless you know precisely how it's prepared. Wild sunflowers, long before their seeds became a snack, offered edible greens and tender buds. The young stems, peeled and steamed, tasted like a cross between asparagus and artichoke. Flower buds, when harvested before opening, brought a mild, nutty flavor to the table. These parts disappeared from kitchens as sunflower breeding shifted toward oil and seed production. Yet, for centuries, they were a valued source of fiber and vitamins. Amaranth, both a leafy green and a grain, stood out for its nutritional completeness. The seeds contain all 9 essential amino acids, making it a rare plant-based source of complete protein. Amaranth thrived in dry, poor soils where other crops withered, and its greens, rich in iron and magnesium, could be sautéed, boiled, or dried for later use. Today, it's rebranded as a superfood, but for native farmers, it was simply reliable nourishment. Wild rice, or manumon, is not true rice but an aquatic grass native to northern lakes and slow rivers. Its grains, harvested by canoe, provided B vitamins, protein, and fiber. But the plant's survival depends on clean, shallow water. Modern drainage and pollution have erased more than half of wild rice beds in Minnesota alone. For Ojibwe and Anishinaabe harvesters, manumon remains a living relative. Its loss threatens both nutrition and culture. Together, these greens and grains reveal a food system built for balance, offering minerals, vitamins, and proteins that modern monocultures rarely match. Their stories remind us that nutrition once came from diversity, not uniformity, and that safety and preparation were as much a part of tradition as the plants themselves. Maypop vines once draped southern fence lines and woods, their flowers releasing a scent that mixed citrus and honey. The fruit, pale green and egg-shaped, concealed a pulp that tasted like a cross between banana and pineapple, tart, sweet, and fleeting. For generations, Cherokee and Creek families gathered maypop for food and medicine, steeping leaves for calming teas and eating the vitamin-rich flesh straight from the husk. Today, maypop lingers mostly in wild thickets and the gardens of the curious, its flavor nearly forgotten. Yaupon holly, a glossy-leafed shrub, is the only native North American plant with caffeine. Before coffee and tea arrived, southeastern tribes brewed yaupon into a smoky, energizing drink called the black drink, central to ceremonies meant to purify and strengthen. Colonial imports pushed yaupon into obscurity, but its ritual echoes remain in the wild, and in a handful of small companies reviving the ancient brew. The taste is earthy and grassy with a smooth lift that lingers long after the cup is empty. Pawpaw, North America's largest native fruit, once ripened in late summer along riverbanks and forest edges. Its golden flesh is soft and custardy with flavors that recall mango, banana, and melon. Pawpaw's season is brief. Fruit ripens for just 2 weeks and spoils within 48 hours of picking. Families once prized the short harvest, eating pawpaw fresh or folding it into puddings and breads. Modern breeders like Neil Peterson have tried to extend its shelf life, but pawpaw remains a rare treat, mostly for foragers and backyard growers. Ground cherries, wrapped in delicate husks, glow gold when ripe. Their flavor is both sweet and tart, with hints of pineapple and tomato. Hardy in poor soils and drought, ground cherries rarely appear in stores. Their fragile skins and short storage life keep them a secret of heirloom gardens and childhood summers. Little barley, a wild grain maturing before corn or wheat, filled hungry months with its nutty flavor and drought resilience. Today, it survives in seed banks, and among those who remember its worth, a reminder that abundance often hides in the overlooked. These fruits and specialty plants offer more than sustenance. They promise flavor, variety, and a connection to landscapes nearly lost. Neil Peterson spent more than 3 decades chasing the perfect pawpaw. In 1975, he started collecting wild seeds across the Appalachian foothills, hiking through abandoned orchards and river bottoms, tracking down trees that bore fruit for just 2 short weeks each September. Peterson's goal was simple but daunting: breed a pawpaw that could survive cold winters, taste sweet and custardy, and last long enough to reach distant markets. Thousands of hand pollinations, scientific trials, and lean years followed. By 2009, Peterson's work paid off. He released patented pawpaw varieties that combined flavor, resilience, and improved shelf life. Yet even now, the fruit's short ripening window and rapid spoilage keep it a rarity outside backyard orchards and specialty growers. Peterson's story is just one thread in a wider tapestry of seed keepers and plant guardians. In seed banks across the country, staff catalog and freeze wild groundnut tubers, amaranth, and little barley, preserving genetic diversity that once flourished untended. Some work quietly, exchanging rare seeds through informal networks, or venturing into threatened habitats to rescue plants before development erases them. These guerrilla gardeners keep groundnut vines alive in hidden gardens, while native seeds, search, and other organizations maintain living collections of crops that commercial agriculture left behind. Each effort is a quiet act of defiance and care. The patience of breeders, the vigilance of seed savers, and the determination of community gardeners have kept these forgotten vegetables from vanishing completely. Their work lays the groundwork for a broader revival, nurturing plants that once fed nations and could do so again if given the chance. In 2018, the White Earth Nation took an unprecedented step and passed an ordinance declaring wild rice, manoomin, a living entity with its own legal rights. The law states that manoomin has the right to exist, flourish, regenerate, and maintain a clean, healthy freshwater habitat free from pollution and genetic contamination. This was the first time in the United States that a plant species was recognized in law as a rights holder. Moving beyond traditional environmental protections to grant legal standing to a native crop itself, tribal leaders, working with the 1855 Treaty Authority and legal advocates, crafted the ordinance in response to mounting threats from water withdrawals and industrial projects, especially oil pipelines crossing northern Minnesota. The new legal framework was tested almost immediately when state agencies approved water permits for pipeline construction in areas critical to wild rice. The White Earth Nation filed suit, arguing that these actions violated both treaty rights and the newly established rights of manoomin. The lawsuit halted construction in some wild rice beds, forcing a pause and drawing national attention to the idea that ecosystems and native foods might hold enforceable rights under the law. Court documents cited scientific evidence showing that wild rice cannot survive when sulfate levels rise or water levels drop, and that pipeline projects placed entire beds at risk of collapse. The case sparked debate far beyond Minnesota, inspiring other tribes and environmental groups to consider rights of nature laws as tools for defending traditional foods and lands. While federal courts have yet to fully recognize these claims, the ordinance stands as a declaration of sovereignty and ecological stewardship. For the White Earth Nation, the fight for manoomin is not just about one plant, but about the future of food, culture, and the right to decide which crops survive. By 1920, over half of regional wetlands had been drained, and millions of acres of prairie were plowed under, documented in federal land surveys and drainage records. These changes erased the habitats and agricultural systems that once supported crops like prairie turnip, groundnut, and wild rice. The documentary has shown that these 15 native plants offered greater nutrition and resilience than many current staples, yet were sidelined by economic policies that favored uniform, easily shipped produce. Despite clear evidence of their value, gaps remain. The full extent of indigenous cultivation methods and lost varieties is still unknown, as many records were never kept or have been lost. Today, efforts from seed banks, indigenous communities, and new legal protections signal a growing recognition of what has been lost. The evidence shows that reclaiming these forgotten vegetables is not just about food. It's about restoring knowledge, biodiversity, and food security for future generations.